The media and the Democrats really are in sync in their lack of knowledge about history, in their contempt for the president, in their over-the-top rhetoric, and in their propaganda. And there was a propaganda piece in Politico, as there often is. It's a left-wing so-called news site. Piece written by a fellow by the name of Bill Scher. And he basically says, and the title of his piece is, Republicans have an Alger Hiss problem named Maria. Maria. The arrest of an alleged Russian spy has conservatives running for cover. Here's what they should do instead. I'm not running for cover. Are you running for cover? No, I'm not running for cover. And we're going to bring back my buddy, Professor Paul Kengor of Grove City, expert on the Cold War and activities before and thereafter, to talk about this. So we'll give a little history lesson to this fool at Politico and to all of us. But just so we understand, Alger Hiss was not a Russian. He was an American. He was working for the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. And he was a spy. He was assisting the Kremlin. That is, working for the Soviet Union. This woman is a Russian working for the Russians. Now, Hiss had a very high-level position in the State Department and as an advisor to FDR, and was involved in the Yalta negotiations, in which, as I've explained before, basically half of Europe was ultimately surrendered to the Soviets, and Joseph Stalin, who killed tens of millions, but whom FDR affectionately called Uncle Joe. Alger Hiss played a direct role in this. So Politico's so-called reporter, contributor, whatever he is, compares Alger Hiss to this Maria Butina. Why? Because he knows most of his readers are stupid and they have no idea who Alger Hiss is, was, or otherwise. And it wasn't just Alger Hiss. There were many more, and we'll get into that too. A whole spy ring that was exposed, and partly exposed with the help of Richard Nixon, which is one of the reasons why the left has always hated Nixon, and the Un-American Affairs Committee. So this writer begins, alleged Russian spy Maria Butina was arrested just a few days ago, short of the 70th anniversary of the last major accusation of Russian infiltration in America's political system, when on August 3, 1948, Time editor and ex-communist Whittaker Chambers publicly accused former high-ranking State Department official Alger Hiss of being a Soviet agent. Rattled Democrats, including President Harry Truman, handled the fallout poorly, hesitating to distance themselves from Hiss and unwittingly feeding a conservative narrative that they were soft on communism. See, it's always an attack on conservatives and patriots and so forth. Republicans are now having their own Alger Hiss moment. This is where this guy gets bizarre. Butina's alleged efforts to ingratiate herself with conservative movement organizations and the Republican Party. Now we know she met with certain Obama officials. I wonder if they'll update this piece. Hello, I said now we know she met with certain Obama officials. He goes on, shows that Russia's interest in Donald Trump is not an operation focused on one man. As explained in the Justice Department affidavit in October 2016, Butina reported to her Russian mentor that Republicans are for us and Democrats against. This is not just about one seductive spy or even one president. It's about how intertwined Russia and the Republican Party are becoming, and whether the Republican Party is willing and able to disentangle itself. Is the Republican Party entangled with Russia? In what way exactly? By defending Trump against these outrageous allegations, not a single scintilla of which is supportable? You mean the Republicans who have voted to increase defense spending? You mean the Republican administration that's taken certain severe steps against Russia where the Obama administration wouldn't? Hiss was convicted of perjury in 1950 for falsely denying in his 1948 congressional testimony that he gave Whittaker Chambers confidential State Department documents to be delivered to the Soviets. Interesting back then, isn't it, that people were actually prosecuted? He served 44 months in prison, then spent the next 42 years maintaining his innocence. Even after intercepts declassified just before his death strongly indicated Hiss was a Soviet agent for years. And by the way, the Democrats supported Hiss, many of them to the end, claiming, no, of course he's not of course he wasn't a Russian spy. Shortly before his fall, Alger Hiss had risen high enough in the State Department to serve as acting General Secretary of the United Nations during the 1945 San Francisco conference that finalized the international organization's charter. When rumors of his Soviet ties prompted his resignation at the end of 1946, his reputation remained strong enough for a Republican, John Foster Dulles, to engineer a smooth transition into the presidency of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His guilt, how come he's not talking about the Democrats? His guilt, while hotly debated for decades, left a lingering stain on the Democratic Party and on liberalism. No, it didn't. Did it leave a lingering stain on them? They do all kinds of crackpot stuff. Does it leave a lingering stain on them? He's just trying to set up Trump and the Republicans, making it difficult for the party to win the public trust on matters both foreign and domestic. If Republicans handle their Alger Hiss moment as awkwardly as Democrats did, they face a similar fate. What Alger Hiss moment? Why was Hiss such a touchstone for the Cold War era? Because for much of the left, he was an honorable man who served 14 years in 3 government departments during the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, only to be smeared in a wave of anti-communist hysteria. He wasn't smeared. Somebody had a scent on the guy. For the right, he was proof that communists were crawling throughout our government, and the liberal Democrats should be suspected of harboring secret anti-American agendas. As Whittaker Chambers wrote in Witness, by the way, a great book, if you haven't read it, when he fingered Hiss and aimed at communism, he also struck out the forces of the great socialist revolution, which in the name of liberalism has been inching its ice cap over the nation for 2 decades. That's what Chambers said, and he was correct. Now, once served time, even though he was never convicted of espionage, the right had the upper hand in the argument. Now, see how a liberal writes and thinks? The right has the upper hand, the left has the lower hand. No, the problem is progressivism, statism. The problem was FDR. It's not the right having the upper hand or the lower hand, but this guy has to create the scenario to act like Donald Trump is facing an Alger Hiss moment, and so are we. No, we're not. The case marked the beginning of the post-World War II ideological fault lines that would shape American politics during the Cold War. The dueling testimonies of Chambers and Hiss to the House Un-American Activities Committee riveted the nation. The relentless pursuit of Hiss made a young congressman from California, Richard Nixon, a rock star in his party before there were rock stars. Days after Hiss's conviction in 1950, Senator Joe McCarthy infamously took the anti-communist crusade to the next level, waving a long list of names he dubiously claimed were Communist Party members working in the State Department. Isn't this similar to the Democrats, waving their lists around? Accusing people of colluding with the Russians? They must have something on Trump. Isn't that the next line, the new line? The Truman administration was blindsided, though it shouldn't have been. The FBI had been investigating Hiss in 45 and 46. And Secretary of State Jimmy Burns and Undersecretary Dean Acheson were fully aware, though Truman may not have been. That scrutiny led to Hiss's quiet resignation, and yet Truman condemned the 1948 hearings as a red herring that was serving no useful purpose and slandering a lot of people that don't deserve it. After the conviction, Acheson, now Secretary of State, remained loyal to his longtime friend, Alger Hiss. Whatever the outcome of any appeal, I do not intend to turn my back on Alger Hiss, said Acheson, citing the Gospel of Matthew for good measure. All Truman would offer was less dramatic, no comment. Now, their posture, he writes, was politically devastating, especially since Alger Hiss's case overlapped with the communist takeover of China. Truman and Acheson lost China, conservative Republicans thundered. Well, they did, as a matter of fact. One Republican senator even speculated that Hiss had shaped the State Department's China policy. The 1952 Democratic presidential nominee, Adlai Stevenson, suffered as well. In 1949, he'd given a deposition for the perjury trial in which he said Hiss had a good reputation and that he hadn't heard any speculation of communist sympathies. The Republican vice presidential nominee, the newly famous Nixon, hammered Stevenson for bad judgment. The man at the top of the ticket, General Dwight Eisenhower, campaigned with McCarthy and charged that communism had poisoned 2 whole decades of our national life. Stevenson won just 9 states. That's not why Eisenhower won. It may have been a reason, but it wasn't even the primary reason. Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 was hugely popular, and the Democrats tried to convince him to run as a Democrat. And he said no. No, he was the conquering general. He was a hero. The cruel irony was that Truman and Atchison were no softies when it came to communism. They were the architects of the anti-communist, quasi-militaristic containment strategy after World War II. Boy, this guy's a lib. A policy both credited for ultimately winning the Cold War, oh right, and maligned for goading the U.S. into these messy Korean and Vietnam wars. Hardly evidence of communist control of the State Department. Is there any doubt that there were communists at the State Department or in the FDR Truman administrations? There were. I mean, these same leftists who insist that Trump is all tied up with the Russians ignore the facts, as we will discuss in 10 or 15 minutes. The Truman administration received little contemporaneous credit for containment at the time, thanks to the triumph of Mao in China and the unpopularity of the inconclusive Korean War. Not much Truman and Atchison could have done about those events. Yeah, right. But they could have taken the Hiss scandal far more seriously. Now, why is he getting into all this? Well, he tells you why. Fast forward to today. We have evidence of a Russian spy infiltrating the conservative movement of the Republican Party in order to influence U.S. politics and foreign policy. We have copious evidence of Russian meddling, here you go, in the 2016 election to help elect a Republican president who has proceeded to frequently parrot the Putin line. Interesting, though, he doesn't mention that Obama told everybody to stand down. What's that all about? Surely our conservative elder statesmen, who for years crowed about Hiss, wouldn't repeat the same mistakes as Truman's Democrats, right? If anyone should have learned political lessons from the Hiss affair, it should have been the fervently anti-Russian yet pro-Trump conservative commentator, and then he does a hit on Hugh Hewitt. Goes on, the typical Republican reaction on Capitol Hill was to welcome Trump's grudging, not so credible walkback from a few of his Helsinki comments. On the Butina case, we mostly hear silence from conservatives, including from Butina's main mark, the National Rifle Association. Though Fox News host Tucker Carlson spent 3 minutes with the Washington Examiner's Byron York downplaying the charges, and some far right-wing voices are even thanking Russians for their participation in American politics. They saved us from Hillary, after all. It goes on. Even among Putin critics, flirtations with Russia don't enrage conservatives today the way they did 70 years ago, because we're not presently in a titanic struggle between communism and capitalism that seems to threaten the American way of life. Of course, at the time when Hiss and a handful of others lower in Roosevelt administration were part of the communist underground, so-called, in the 1930s, the Cold War had not yet begun, and during World War II, America and Soviet Union were allies of convenience. And it goes on. You get the point here? The end, he says, Soviet communism is dead, but Putinism lives, and is all too often echoed by Trump and his loyalists. Republicans have a choice to make. Repeat the mistakes made by Alger Hiss's defenders out of short-term political expediency, or live up to the honorable example set by Whittaker Chambers, even if it means taking the chance of joining the losing world. So, you see, ladies and gentlemen, this what's-her-name, who has infiltrated the conservative movement and the Republican Party, and I might add, met with Obama officials, and we don't know the full extent of that because Mr. Mueller hasn't helped us with that, nor have others, is like Alger Hiss? Really? Well, we need to pursue that a little bit more deeply than Politico.
Mark Levin, the champion of liberty and true conservatism. Call Mark now, 877-381-3811.
Professor Paul Kengor, how are you, sir? Grove City University, welcome back.
Hey, Mark, good to be back. Thanks.
All right, listen, we have this article today, Politico, pointing out that this Russian woman is akin to Alger Hiss. Now, this can't be true, can it?
No, I'll tell you, that one really floored me. I mean, it just shows, like you and I were talking about the other day, how people on the left have just gone to hysterical proportions on this. And, I mean, for one thing, I don't know where to start on this, but first of all, Alger Hiss was an American working for the government, working for the State Department, among other things, and this woman's not an American, right? I mean, she's a Russian, but to give you just one idea, kind of for starters, what Hiss was doing and how this is in no way comparable. I mean, Hiss in the 1930s, and this is what the Hiss-Whittaker-Chambers case became all about. That was a case that went from about 1948 to 1950. But Hiss was a government official. He illegally took classified files from his State Department office. What he would do, Mark, is he would wait till the end of the day when everybody had left and there was maybe a secretary there who trusted him, and he would put the documents in his briefcase, and then he took these documents home and he gave them to his wife, Priscilla. And then Priscilla would type up duplicates of these documents, these classified documents, and then they would be delivered to the Soviets, and then Hiss would bring them back the next morning. And the courier, if you will, who did this was Whittaker-Chambers. And Chambers, who, and this is right out of the biography of Whittaker-Chambers by Sam Tannenhouse, the old New York Times guy who's a liberal and a very good historian, wrote a really good biography of Chambers. But Chambers said under oath that he was a courier for these documents from Hiss, quote, at least 52 times, unquote. And Chambers would take these to a Soviet agent named Boris Bykov, who would then deliver them to the Kremlin. So this Maria Butina, who, I've read what they've said about her, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly she did that was so nefarious. But I can tell you this, she didn't do nearly anything as bad as what Alger Hiss did to his government in the 1930s and 1940s.
It is amazing because even in this Politico article, you don't know what she did. He doesn't
Right.
tell us what she did, and he really doesn't tell us what Hiss does in any significant way, does he?
No, he really doesn't. I mean, I guess to his credit, he gets a lot of the Hiss sort of basic facts right, but it's kind of what he does with them and where he goes from there that's the problem. But it's off the top of my head, but I think he pointed out that Hiss went to jail for about 4 years, right? I think he was convicted in 1950. He was convicted for perjury. These are the kind of details that are in there. And
where did he perjure himself?
He perjured himself before a jury, a grand jury, and that's in fact what he went to prison for. And probably the only funny thing that Hiss ever said or did was he said that 4 years in a federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, was an excellent corrective to 4 years at Harvard. So,
but here's the thing. Hiss was defended almost right to the end by many Democrats and leftists and newspapers in this country.
Oh, yeah. No, it's absolutely right.
They thought he was railroaded.
Yeah, they did. There is an Alger Hiss chair, or at least there used to be at Bard College. I mean, Alger Hiss has been defended by the left from the very beginning, 1940, for decades, and I think it was the late Arthur Schlesinger who was a man on the left, but the so-called, pretty honest liberal, and he even said something to the effect of, "Well, we and all of Alger's friends knew that he was guilty, but we remained as friends anyway." But even then, there's a lot of people on the left that absolutely refuse to admit that he was even guilty. And the New York Times, Washington Post, and others, they tried to downplay what Hiss did at Yalta, suggesting that he was a, quote, mere note taker, a glorified office boy was one of the phrases that they used.
Who was? Let me give you a few names: Harry Dexter White,
Yeah,
Lachlan Kerry, Frank Coe. Who are all these people?
Yeah, these were among the many Soviet agents or agents of influence, closet CPUSA members, although Harry Dexter White actually wasn't a Communist Party USA member. And in fact, a real difficult problem with a lot of this, Mark, is trying to separate a Soviet spy from a CPUSA member to an agent of influence. And sometimes the worst thing that you could get would be somebody who would stand before the House Committee on Un-American Activities and truthfully say, no, I'm not a member of the Communist Party, and I never have been, because a lot of those guys didn't join the party because they didn't want to take direct orders from Moscow, and they could help Moscow more as a non-party member.
So who was Harry Dexter White?
So Harry Dexter White was in the Treasury Department. He just major influence on behalf of the Russians and the Kremlin, many different ways, was called to testify for it, I think, in 1946, and pretty much lied through his teeth in that testimony, and then died of a heart attack very, very shortly after that. But he was one among many.
Well, let's go through some quickly before we run out of time.
Yeah.
Lachlan Curry, who was that?
Lachlan Curry, another one. Probably the very worst that I think nobody would dispute today, of high-level FDR officials who caused serious problems. Lachlan Curry, Harry Dexter White would be at the top of the list. They were higher ranking than Alger Hiss. Then there was people like Harold Glasser, Lee Pressman, Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins is controversial. The Herb Romerstein of the Venona Papers, who died a few years ago, I think you and I both knew him, and he's convinced that Harry Hopkins, who was the single closest aide to both FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, the guy actually lived in the White House. But Romerstein is convinced that Harry Hopkins was Agent 19 in the Venona Papers, and some people dispute that. They say, well, he wasn't a spy, but he was definitely a dupe and a useful.
But I want the audience to understand that when they're talking about Trump collusion with Russia, and the best they can do is a phony FISA warrant against Carter Page, and maybe there was a meeting with a woman who was pushing to change the Maginski Act, or this woman, Futima, whatever the hell she did. It doesn't come anywhere close to what was going on in Franklin Roosevelt's administration, which was over the top with these people.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And to give you an example of this, what exactly Alger Hiss did at Yalta, I mean, Alger Hiss, the spy that we're talking about, was actually at Yalta. And that was the February 1945 final conference that FDR participated in, where they sold out not only Eastern Europe, Poland, but other parts of the globe. And we now have this documentation. This is directly from Edward Stettinius, who was FDR's Secretary of State at the time, actually Secretary of State at the time of Yalta. And this is Stettinius's papers are now at the University of Virginia. Liberal historians, if they really wanted to, could go down there and look through these. Stan Evans and Herb Romerstein and others actually did look through it. But they had all through Stettinius's papers when he's talking about Yalta, quote, Alger Hiss can fill in the background, unquote. This is on German assigning a German occupation zone to France. Another, see Alger Hiss about this. A third, see Alger and we'll discuss this again. Fourth, Hiss would remember, consult him. 5, see Alger Hiss again. 6, see Alger Hiss about this. 7, quote, Alger Hiss can fill in important background on that, unquote. So that all kind of goes beyond the whole issue of glorified office boy or note taker at Yalta. And it also certainly shows that I don't know what Maria Butina did, or actually I know what they're saying that she did. It nowhere even begins to compare to what people like Alger Hiss was doing.
And very quickly, to bring us closer to this decade, although not close enough, Ted Kennedy, you've written about this extensively. In all the media coverage, I mean, he's a fairly contemporary figure, even though he passed some years ago. He's well known to many people listening to this program, young people listening to this program. He was involved in left-wing causes up the wazoo, blocking conservative causes, from a prominent family. The media loved him. They never bring him up with respect to the old Soviet Union and how he worked closely with the Kremlin to try and defeat Ronald Reagan. Just a few minutes on that, if you can, Paul.
Yeah, sure. And let me add one thing very quickly from Harvard's Cold War History Project. This is, they concluded that the Venona papers revealed that more than 350 Americans, including numerous high-level U.S. government officials and scientists working on the Manhattan Project, were spying for Soviet intelligence agencies in the late 1930s and 1940s. Now, that's under FDR. More than 350 Americans spying for Soviet agencies in the 30s and 40s. But yeah, Ted Kennedy, we have a May 14th, 1983 document. It's written by Viktor Chebrikov, the head of the KGB, to Yuri Andropov, the head of the Soviet Union. And the very top of it says, regarding Senator Kennedy's request to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Yuri Andropov. And they go through there and they talk about a confidential contact made by a liaison, John Tunney, who had been a Democratic senator from California in the 1970s. He was an old law school roommate of Ted Kennedy. He was the conduit for this, and it was an offer by Kennedy to meet with Andropov. It even says in the document, he's willing to fly to Moscow to meet with him directly. He's willing to help Soviet political and military officials come to the United States. Kennedy's willing to help them, introduce them to American media figures. They even named Walter Cronkite and Barbara Walters in the memo. And all of this is set within the context of the dangerous Ronald Reagan, who, as it notes throughout the document, is up for re-election next year. And he's riding high. Reaganomics is working. The economy's soaring. But Kennedy's very troubled by Reagan as a threat to peace. Kennedy says, to the contrary, that Kennedy is very impressed, are the exact words used, with Yuri Andropov. And so this whole Kennedy overture and outreach is set within the context of Reagan's 1984 re-election.
And you hear none of this in the context of what they're accusing Trump of. Russia, 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 Russia. I can't find all the Russia, 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 Russia involving Trump. Can you?
No, and I mean, if you want a smoking gun document, a piece of hard evidence, I mean, what could be stronger than a literal KGB document written by the literal head of the KGB? This isn't somebody who's a staffer for the KGB. So the head of the KGB, Viktor Chebrikov, writing to the head of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov. And that document was found by a London Times BBC reporter named Tim Sebastian. It was first reported in the London Times, February 1992. And just a little bit of it was reported. He didn't actually publish the document. I published the document in full in a book in 2006, and then again in another book called Dupes in 2010, where I published both the English and the Russian and
would that make Ted Kennedy a traitor?
Well, I don't know if it makes him a traitor, but it certainly makes him scheming and duplicitous and doing something pretty damn bad that somebody on the left you think would care about.
But John Brennan, the CIA director before the last two CIA directors who worked for Obama, think he'd call Kennedy a traitor? No, because John Brennan, as you point out and others, voted for Gus Hall, the head of the Communist Party United States of America, and he knew all about Gus Hall, didn't he?
Well, and Gus Hall, who was, head of Communist Party USA, his guys in Moscow at that time that John Brennan voted for him would have been Yuri Andropov at the KGB and Leonid Brezhnev as head of the Soviet Union. And you know, this Kennedy stuff, I note the dates on when I published it, because when I first published those documents in a 2006 book, Kennedy lived for, I'd have to look it up, I think 2 or 3 years after that. And nobody, and prior to that, 14 years earlier, 1992, was the piece in the London Times. The London Times. I mean, it's a very respectable newspaper.
I've got 1 minute. Any major news outlet interview you about this?
None.
Any today, other than this show?
No, none whatsoever. I've never.
None. They haven't asked you about Ted Kennedy. They haven't asked you about Alger Hiss. They haven't asked you about the Roosevelt administration, have they?
No, because I think they're afraid of what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So when
that is the facts.
Yeah, that's right. When they know that you have information like this, they ignore you. If I had my facts wrong, they'd probably attack me and nuke it. Well,
Professor, I'm on a hard break. As always, we love having you, and I very much appreciate your contribution. Keep it up. He's a good friend, Paul Kengor, Grove City. God bless you, my friend. We'll be right back. Can you imagine Al Sharpton discussing this, or Mika Brzezinski, or Joe Scarborough, or Don Lemon, or Katie Tur, or Jake Tapper? Can you imagine any of them discussing this? No. They're too stupid. That's number one. But number two, they don't give a damn. Because they're all ideological, political hacks. I'm sorry. But don't blame me. All right, we'll be right back. Let me jump to an interesting caller who represents himself as an individual who worked in Congress during the Hiss case. Max, Washington, D.C., the great WMAL. How are you, sir?
Pretty good, Mark.
What years were those where you worked in Congress?
I actually started in '69 while I was in graduate school and worked for a congressman, and then later on I did a study for the Senate Internal Security Committee, and I was also a undercover operative who testified before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee.
But Hiss, per se, most of that occurred in the 40s and 50s, correctly?
Yes.
Correct,
yes.
rather? Yeah.
Yes, I was lucky enough to meet with Chambers in 1961, shortly before he died. He gave a talk at a boys' club I was in Baltimore. And the story he told then was exactly what he wrote in Witness and what he testified before Congress. But the follow-up would be is that I also met the man, Isaac Don Levine, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, who took Hiss to see A.A. Burrell in the White House early in the 40s. And Burrell was the man who was going to take the information up to FDR to tell him that there's something suspicious about Hiss and that Chambers was the man who could identify him. The question is, what happened to that information? Did it get cut off by Lachlan Curry?
Here's the thing. How is it that FDR didn't even have a hint about what Hiss was doing?
Because he was sandwiched in by a group of leftists, including some identified Soviet agents who kept the information from him. And then also, I don't think he wanted to hear much about it. He was in fighting World War II, and he thought about Stalin as our devil, and we have to work with him, so I don't want to ruffle his feathers and upset the alliance.
But there were people in the administration who were concerned about Hiss and the Soviet Union, and he wasn't listening to them.
That's right, and that's what Isaac Don Levine and some of the others were saying, that the information flow to FDR was very guarded by some of the people around him, which was Dexter White and Lachlan Curry and a couple others. There's some other spies involved in this that I don't think have ever been unmasked. Because if you go back into 1940, you'll find Alger Hiss and his wife and his brother and Lee Pressman and the others of the Silver Master Ware group all in one big communist liberal front here in Washington. And that list is going to be on the Internet, hopefully within the next couple of weeks or so.
And Hiss, you tell my call screener, was not of the KGB. He was of the GRU, the military side of the Soviet Union.
That's right, and that's what's happened in the last couple of years, that the people who've been arrested here, I was doing a couple of cases the other day, were GRU, not KGB. What do you make of the media in this country that provide no context, that say nobody has sold out America to the Russians like Trump has? And honestly, Max, and I'm being quite honest about this, if I thought Trump was selling out to the Russians, I'd turn on him in 2 seconds. I just don't see it. Okay, I'll make you happy. I used to write for Human Events as an investigative reporter. And I covered the Hill, I covered internal security, and I covered Vietnam. So I learned from very good writers on how to look for information. And Alan Riskin used to say...
Alan Riskin was an old friend of mine.
Yes, he said, you write it concise, write it clear, and always document everything you write. And those are the 3 lines. That was my total journalism school education. And I tried to adhere to it because of Alan and all the other great people who were around.
All right, but back to my question about Trump. I don't see any of this in Trump, do you?
No. Donald Trump is his own man. Sometimes he's a bit rough around the edges, and he's not a politician, so he's not saying the things that politicians would like to do as a weasel.
Is there any evidence you're observing publicly, like the rest of us? They don't like his press conference. Is there any evidence through any actions or his appointments of Bolton and Pompeo and Mattis that he has any inclination to sell out to the Russians?
No, especially with Bolton, because John Bolton, who impresses me, is one of the most intelligent, knowledgeable men we've ever had in our diplomatic service. And I don't think he's going to let the president get caught up in something that's really disastrous. But don't forget, people are setting up the president. This is what I'm seeing, because the whole Steele dossier was based on 3 Russian sources, there's the Russian collusions between Steele, the DNC, and Fusion, and those 3 sources. It didn't start out with any Americans down here. So people would like to gloss over that particular connection and say, oh, it's Trump, somebody, Mattis had a meeting, or Flynn.
Now, Max, you must be amazed at how the Democrats, who for the most part were defending Hiss and this whole ring of spies and so forth, for so many decades, and now all of a sudden they're concerned about Russia. Do you actually believe that?
Not at all. I want to refer you to a document that's on the internet that has not been given a lot of publicity. That Paul Kanger did his Russian archives piece. But in 1970, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a report on Soviet targeting of members of the U.S. Congress and their staffs. It's on a site called KeyWiki, KEYWIKI.org, under Edward Kennedy's section. And the whole text of that document, listing all the members of Congress who were targeted by the KGB, are there. And Ted Kennedy's name is right up there.
All right, Max. Well, I want to thank you. I bet you'd be fascinating to have dinner with. You take care of yourself, and thank you. How about that? Oh, I know. I could take the show in another direction. I will at some point. But context and history is a very, very important thing. And if I don't discuss it with people who are knowledgeable about it, it won't be discussed. When you think about all the media outlets there on cable, on network, on satellite, on the internet, and so forth, and how little of this is actually discussed, it's incredible to me. And so you have young people listening to Trump and Russia, and he's tied up with Russia, and the spies in Russia. Wait a minute. Not only is that false, but the very party that's attacking this president has its fingerprints and DNA, historically, all over Russia. As they do segregation, as they do slavery. It's important to understand our history. I don't care how many monuments they tear down, how many books they burn. Ed, Memphis, Tennessee, Sirius Satellite, go.
Mark.
Yes, Ed, go.
Yes, I think the terminology you used is incorrect. This young lady is a spy, which is an honorable thing to spy for your own country. Alger Hiss is a traitor.
All right, sir. Thank you for your call. He was also a spy. Okay, correct my... You call over semantics, really? You hang on for I don't know how long. Well, anyway. Tom, Washington, D.C., the great WMAL. Go.
Oh, thank you. I was going to bring up the point, but your guest beat me to it, about how, wait a minute, the left was telling us all along these people were innocent. Now they're saying, oh, it's worse than Hiss? Wait a minute. You said Hiss was innocent. But I will take it the next step. This is way back when I was a kid. You and I are about 2 years age. I was in first grade, and I had a teacher who just got way off the lessons and was telling us all about the Rosenbergs and how they were innocent and railroaded by McCarthyism and all to death. My parents, the point I want to make is I got home.
We have a very bad connection, so get right to your point, please.
Okay. The point was that my parents asked, they monitored our education, they just happened to ask that day. When I told them what I was taught in school, they went through the roof. I had my father the tank all through my life. He taught me critical thinking skills and pointing out this stuff, and he was warning me about the media.
Thank you for your call. The connection is just, it's giving me, with my headphones, it's hurting my ears, actually. Didn't they create an Ethel Rosenberg Day of Justice in New York City, Mr. Producer? Will you Google that for me, please? It just shows you how serious the left is. Got DeCamio as the mayor and so forth. Got leftists, communists, democratic socialists, Marxists, whatever they want to label themselves. It's all of the same community mindset. I'm pretty sure I remember this. I don't believe I spoke about it, but the Ethel Rosenberg Day of Justice in New York City, for some reason that sticks in my mind. In the borough of Manhattan, tell me, when was that? That's what I thought. September 28, 2015, the borough of Manhattan. Ethel Rosenberg Day of Justice in New York City. She was convicted, along with her husband, of providing the plans to the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And she celebrated in Manhattan because of the injustice that was done in her execution. Amazing. I'm sure John Brennan agrees, because only Donald Trump, you see, is guilty of treason. I'll be right back. Max, I know your last name now. I'm told you're absolutely legit and that you've done fabulous work in helping to uncover significant information, and so I want to thank you for that. You sounded legit to me and to my call screener, so you got through, and that's a good thing, so I want to thank you for that. A few more calls on this, then we'll roll along. Please, I don't want another caller telling me that Trump's playing four-dimensional chess. Please. That's a meaningless phrase. Just defend the president. You don't have to get goofy. What the hell is four-dimensional chess? Do you know what it is, Rich? I don't even know what three-dimensional chess is. Playing four-dimensional chess? I don't think he's playing four-dimensional chess. I think he calls them as he sees them. And he uses his business experience and his life experiences and tries to apply them. Doesn't mean he's perfect. He's not. But it means he's different. And he may get us to places where we need to be that others couldn't. Give me this four-dimensional chess crap. Nobody even knows what that means. Well, let's Google it. Let's continue, shall we? Bob, Long Beach, California, 870 The Answer. Go.
You're a great American, Mark. I want to agree with what the professor said and the last two callers. Let's see. There was an American Communist Party. In the 1930s and the 1940s, and Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White belonged to it, and they were in the State Department. And if you were a leader of the American Communist Party, you had to be a spy. And Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White wrote the United Nations Charter. Whittaker Chambers was the leader of the American Communist Party, and he left it, put his life in danger, and Elizabeth Bentley took over.
All right. Listen to me a second. Everybody knows where to find this stuff. I have a question for you. May I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Why is it that when we dig into Alger Hiss and these connections and Ted Kennedy and so forth, the media has absolutely no interest whatsoever? Yet, they concoct, manufacture, all this stuff about Russia and Trump. It's day in, day out, day in and day out. What I'm trying to do, it's not about whataboutism, although that's important. It's not about hypocrisy, although that's very important. It's about showing that they're frauds. They care about the Russians. They've never cared about the Russians. They don't even care about properly funding our military in order to deal with the Russians and the Chinese and the rest of these threats that we face in this country. They opposed SDI. You know who else opposed SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative? The Soviets. And so I look at this. I look at these clowns in the media, mostly low IQ buffoons, who have no historical context whatsoever and don't want one. Their attacks on Trump, they're all worked up about this Helsinki press conference, and they don't bring up anything about things you can actually touch in history that the Democrat Party did, and some Republicans too, but the Democrat Party primarily in selling out to the Soviets and the Russians. How do you explain that, sir?
Well, I believe the Republicans never fight back. They run and hide. You talk about status, and you associate it with the Democrat Party. And I think I'm a history major. I got my degree in American history. The progressives came from...
All right, do you think the Republicans are soft progressives like I think?
Oh, yes. Only the Freedom Caucus is the only one that has any...
Why do we need a Freedom Caucus within the Republican Party? Shouldn't the whole Republican Party be the Freedom Caucus?
Exactly.
All right, sir. Thank you for agreeing with me. Getting some very good callers, I might say. Liberals, you're free to call. We always leave a line open. We have a special line for you. 877-381-3811. That's our liberal line. Timothy, Portland, Oregon, the great KUFO. Go.
Hello, Mr. Mark. This is Timothy Paul. I'm so glad.
All right, sir. Go right ahead, please, before we run out of time.
Yeah, so, I have a little bit different approach. The Communism Party, very, very shrewd. I lived what you guys talking about, coming from Romanian Communist Party, been in jail 4 times.
Ceausescu.
Exactly. I'm so glad to be to the United States. Thanks God and thanks to American people who allowed me to become a citizen about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There was an article in Romanian.
All right. My question, Timothy, to bring it to present day. You think Trump is selling out to the Russians?
No.
Or do you think the Democrats have had a long history of selling out to the Russians?
That's what it is, the Democrats. But they like to point fingers to others. That's always the strategy of what they do. Mm-hmm. They shouting, catch the thief. The thief shouting, catch the thief. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what they're doing. So the ideas of communism, you can see reflecting in ideas right now from a lot of Democrats running for office. Exactly the communist idea.
See, my attitude right now is, Timothy, if the Democrats want to talk about Russia, let's talk about Russia. And let's talk about communism. And let's talk about the Soviet Union. And let's talk about Hiss and Yalta. Let's talk about FDR's administration. Let's talk about Ted Kennedy. Let's talk. Let's do it. But they won't, and they don't. Thank you for your call, sir, and I'm glad you're here as well. It's like, you want to talk about race? Let's talk about race. Let's talk about the Democrat Party and slavery and segregation and Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy. Let's do it. But they don't want to do it because their fingerprints are all over it. I'm quite serious about this. I think if more and more people understood the nature of the early Democrat Party, the heritage of the Democrat Party, fewer and fewer of them would be Democrats. But the Democrat Party is able to camouflage all this because they have the media in their back pocket and they basically promote one form or another of the welfare state or socialism, if you will. The term doesn't matter as much. The point is, big government, handouts, it's just another way of controlling the individual. It's just another way of propagandizing. That's what they do. That's what they're about because they are, in the end, statists. Everything's about government. Listen to this 28-year-old moron. Listen to Bernie Sanders. Government should do this. Government should do this. Government should do that. Is that in the Declaration? Is that in the Constitution? Of course not. I'll be right back.